review, as usual, every weekend. Now, we have a couple of things to cover, but at the same time, there's not too much that has changed since last week's show. Uh, the U.S. border with Mexico continues to be an issue, and really the reason or the excuse that's being used to prevent a lot of reform from going through both the House and the Senate, but mostly the U.S. Senate. So we're going to really take a look at just understanding what's happening now at the U.S. border, because not much has changed in terms of the overcapacity of the centers, but what has been developing is the relationship and the dynamic between Mexico and countries bordering Mexico. That's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They've come to some agreements to help try and stem the flow of migration. We're going to look at some articles on that, as well as looking at President Biden's recent flip in terms of his view on the refugee cap of how many refugees we're able to take in, and some good news that came out of Washington. We covered it last week, but now it's been made official in terms of banning for-profit detention centers. And lastly, a not surprising, but rather concerning, I would say, piece of news in terms of the House Republicans and them trying to push far-right ideas, which include really restricting immigration, since that's relevant to us, before going into an update on immigration reform. So again, to start with our first topic, we're going to look at what happened on April 12th and April 14th in terms of reporting from the Associated Press. I'm going to just set up my screen here to share an article for you. But what you're going to see is that things have been getting a little bit more complicated in terms of the border situation. And let me quickly add it in here. Okay. So just to first take a look at this previous article, this is the one from April 12th. And from the press secretary, it seems that Mexico is really taking a step forward in terms of deploying its own troops. Even Guatemala has stated that they're sending police and military to their own borders along with Honduras to try and stem the flow of migration. I believe it was Guatemala that has been doing a lot to break up a lot of migrant caravans heading to the U.S. border, or on pathway towards the U.S. border. And so what we're seeing now is really this up of what we had expected when the White House had stated that they were going to try and take diplomatic approaches to addressing the crisis at the U.S. border. Now, as the press secretary said, Jen Psaki, said that the objective is to make it more difficult to make the journey and make crossing the border more difficult. So I have mixed feelings about this because, again, the root issues that are causing people to leave their countries continue to be unresolved. Obviously, violence, poverty, lack of opportunity in their countries, and this apparently very brazen corruption within the country's governments. And so we're trying to make the journey more difficult to get here, more dangerous even. And this will only really serve to put more people's lives at risk, because if the actual push, the reasons that are pushing people out of their countries continues to be unresolved, people will still come, but obviously they're going to rely more on traffickers. They're going to rely on more dangerous routes to be able to come to the U.S. The idea that having more police, more military along these borders is going to somehow completely stem the flow makes no sense. The actual flow will continue. It may dissuade certain people who are choosing to go, but again, people who are desperate and want to leave and find better opportunity are still going to go. This is only going to serve to make it more dangerous. And again, more reliance on trafficking through coyotes or any other means to come to the U.S. So we're going to have to see how this plays out. And the interesting thing, I can't remember if it was in this article or in this second article from the 14th, where they try and specify that the Vice President, Kamala Harris, was not really involved in these discussions, but it was very surprising, because if you remember maybe 2 weeks ago, we covered an article, news reports, about how the Vice President was put into a diplomatic role in trying to help stem the flow of migration from these countries to the U.S. But apparently, even if this was a diplomatic approach, she was not actually involved in any of these talks. So very surprising. I had figured that she would have been involved in this, and it does raise a question of what is she actually doing to help the border crisis situation and to stem the flow of migration to the U.S. I've not seen any real reporting on her role, what projects she has going on, or what talks she's been having with foreign leaders. So I do worry that one, it's a couple of parts. One is that the Biden administration is not fully comprehending what the different aspects of this flow of migration to the U.S. as in the push factor is still there, meaning the rather difficult situations in these countries of origin. And then obviously the second piece is the border policies. So the fact that it's very, I guess, very unmotivating, the fact that, the vice president is not actually doing much to help alleviate this in terms of that first piece of the push factor towards migration. I'm worried. I'm worried to see whether or not the Biden administration will be able to handle this border crisis in time to be able to push forward immigration reform, especially a comprehensive immigration reform that we are very desperate for. So we're going to have to keep an eye on this. And I mean, this has been a recurring piece in the show each weekend, which is just an update on the border and how difficult it has been. The next story we want to cover involves the Biden administration being pressured recently. I believe the way that this story began is that the Biden administration did not plan on lifting the refugee cap, meaning the number of refugees that we're able to take in to the U.S. And admit them. And so the issue was that the former president, Donald Trump, had set it to, I believe, only 15,000. And so because of that, the Biden administration had not intended to lift it. So it would remain at 15,000. Now this decision became widely criticized for the fact that people are in need and we need to be able to accept more. And so they did not give a timeline and there was no direct statement on this, but the press secretary, Jen Psaki, did mention that Biden, after being pressured, says roughly May 15th, they're looking to increase it, but no specifics on how much. So we're hoping it does increase. Again, it's currently at 15,000. Whether that's going to be increased by quite a bit into maybe 20,000, right? And that's the thing. It really does depend. And we had to also look at what it was before President Trump had capped it to 15,000. If we can revert back, that'd be okay. If we can increase it beyond that point, that'd also be fantastic. We're going to have to see how this plays out, but just to also put that out there, that it's not just an issue at the U.S. border. It's also the different systems of immigration that need to be reworked after having been attacked so heavily by the former president for those 4 years that he was in office. So this was a very quick story, but just to at least put that on your radar as well. Next, we're going back in time a little bit to April 14th for some very good news, I would say. And I think this is something that we can look towards as an example of where we need to be headed going forward. And hopefully more states can really hop onto this and push for this. And it is that the Washington state governor signed the bill that we had mentioned last week to ban for-profit detention centers in the state of Washington. Now, again, there's only one detention center operating in for-profit detention center operating in the state of Washington, but now they will be closed once their contract ends in 2025. So just in case there's mixed reporting on this, they will no longer be able to renew their contract, but they will have to finish their contract by 2025. So we're going to have to see how this plays out, but it is still good news that going forward over the next generations, the state of Washington will be added to the list of states in the U.S. that have made the right decision to not profit off of the suffering of people. So I think that is an amazing step forward. I think we're going to hope at least that more states can copy this if they haven't already. There's not much else to add to this. Again, it's just more good, happy news to add into this, considering we tend to really cover a lot of stories that aren't that happy and tend to involve a lot of human suffering. That tends to be the case for the immigration system and what we're trying to fight to change. So hopefully, again, more states copy this and more positive news can come. now to kind of take the opposite turn, we're going to talk about something that's slightly concerning, as I had mentioned, and that's from April 17th, so today, is that House Republicans have now formed a new America First caucus. And if that sounds familiar, it's because they are trying to form it based on the ideals of former President Donald Trump. And no surprise, the prominent members are very far right thinkers, as in Marjorie Taylor Greene is one of those members, and Matt Gaetz, who's currently being investigated for suspicion of child sex trafficking. So, when Trump says, that he wanted the best, this is, I guess, the best that they got for this kind of a caucus. Now, again, the reason why this is concerning is more so because if we actually look at the platform of this caucus, you can imagine just how far right they are. And I actually happen to have their platform that they published not too long ago. Again, it was most likely today that this really came up. I'm only going to read a little bit of it just to give you an idea of what this is going for, because I think it's very valuable to at least see how the political landscape is transforming as there's a split within the Republican Party of whether or not they want to closely align themselves with the former president or if they want to continue going down a more moderate route, although there's some nuances to that, which I can explain later. But just to go through this, the America First Caucus, AFC, exists to promote congressional policies that are to the long-term benefit of the American nation. The North Star of any policy proposal will be that which serves the American people, and any consequential analysis of policy platforms must be based on this first principle. Now, it doesn't sound too bad when it's said that way, but then we start looking at the actual platform of what they're standing for, and yeah, you can see where this is getting off the rails right away, right? The immediate first one is about election fraud. No surprise, considering they believe that the last election was fraudulent and that President Trump should be the president again. So that is their first mark of business. They talk about sovereignty, big tech, a lot of things that we have seen President Trump rail against and complain about are included in here. But what's important to us is this bit on immigration, which, as you can see, is very, very long compared to some of these other points. So you can expect that this kind of a caucus will be constantly attacking immigration policy in not a good way to improve the system, but rather to make it more difficult to immigrate to the U.S., and also in terms of if you're an undocumented immigrant, to punish you more severely. Let's see, I think there was something interesting here. I mean, interesting in a rather morbid way. So as such, America's legal immigration system should be curtailed to those that can contribute not only economically, but have demonstrated respect for this nation's culture and rule of law. America's borders must be defended, and illegal immigration must be stopped without exception. So this is really a Anglo-Saxon-based kind of caucus, right? So they believe that it is the more like European immigrants, that they are the better form of an immigrant. And so it is going a bit mask off, is the saying, when it comes to representatives who are starting to make it very clear that they have a certain agenda and a certain view of who is the preferred immigrant, or who counts, who qualifies as a U.S. citizen. And it is typically, as they say, an Anglo-Saxon white American has to be the preferred picture-perfect American. And so, honestly, this doesn't surprise me. We have seen a surge of far-right representatives coming to the U.S. Congress. And so, is it surprising? No. Is it worrying? Yes. Because really what we are allowing to go forward is this precedent that representatives can be brazenly racist. And that is never a good thing, because this reflects or it gets reflected into our policies. And so if we allow this kind of a caucus to just continue spewing very much like lies and myths that are stereotypes, especially of immigrants, and where they make it very clear that they want America to stay as what they say is like they don't want immigrants to come ruin their culture and just really push away who they view as an American citizen. Well, then this is what's going to happen. That exact idea, those exact ideas will be embedded into the policies that they will push forward. So again, very concerning that there's a caucus like this in the U.S. Congress, but it's not surprising, especially after the past 4 years. And what we've seen happening throughout the country is just a very big push towards the far right. And I did mention that there is a bit of a split in the Republican Party. I mean, this news report from Politico kind of explains it. If you remember, President Bush from a while ago, he by no means was a good president. I mean, going into an endless war and just in general, it's such a mess up. Now he is saying that immigration reform must happen, and that was one of his biggest regrets, not being able to do it when he was president. Now, of course, there's the caveats that he believes that it must involve stricter enforcement at the border and just in general more regulations on immigration, but that there should be some way for even undocumented immigrants to work their way towards getting citizenship. Again, I would imagine that his view of a pathway to citizenship more closely reflects the dignity proposal, which Republicans had introduced a while back and still haven't followed up on actually making it into legislation for us to actually read and know what they're talking about. But that's more so what I imagine he would think should be a immigration reform going forward. So again, we have a fringe group inside of the Republican Party, which is really starting to commit to these far right ideas outside of reality and outside of any kind of factual basis, and just making claims however they want to push their own Anglo-Saxon white agenda, I guess I can say it that way. While you also have a different part of the Republican Party, which is more focused on stay cordial, try and fake bipartisanship, while also still pushing rather restrictive immigration policy, but not as clear and brazen as a far right ideology. So we're going to have to see what happens with the Republican Party going forward. Again, it's very much fracturing right now, similar to the Democratic Party and how there's a big push to try and push it more to the left. If you were to see where we are politically in terms of far right ideas, far left ideas, and just to give them some names, right, if you were to think about more socialist ideas in terms of an expanded welfare state and so forth along those lines, we are actually not even in the middle where people think we are. We're actually still more towards the right, which is more restrictive, more punishing, especially to workers and immigrants. That seems to be where we are right now. So I would much rather us be bold in our ideas and trying to push ourselves more towards the left. Not to say that we need to go all the way to being a communist country, but it is to say that we do need to overhaul our systems to be more compassionate and humane towards not only immigrants, but also U.S. workers. Because if the COVID pandemic has taught us anything, our systems are not made for that. And really, workers are the ones who are suffering, while a more elite group get to benefit from really all of that suffering. That, again, is a different topic outside of immigration news. But again, I just like to share some of those ideas and talk about it here. Now, to switch away from the news, I think that's really the highlights of it. I do want to talk a little bit about what happened recently in terms of immigration reform, and I'll expand this up a little bit so you can see as well. But this is back on the 13th of April. I'm going to quickly switch my banner here so it can reflect what we're about to talk about. But it is the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act. If you remember back in March, I believe it was March 15th, this bill was introduced into the House and the Senate with the hope that in the first spending bill, we would have been able to give a pathway to citizenship for essential workers. And now essential workers is defined very broadly and covers quite a lot of people. And I'll put up a fact sheet in a second to explain that, but just to talk about what happened here, because it is important, and it's the reason why this is being brought up now, a month later, after this act didn't move at all within the House and Senate, is that, well, the representatives who had sponsored the bill, along with some co-sponsors, sent a letter, this is the electronic copy of that letter, to President Biden at the White House, urging him to include the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act into the next spending bill, right? So this would be the infrastructure bill. I believe it's called if it says it here, American Families Plan, and the legislative package. So what this would do is to essentially fast track it, right? It will be just embedded within the next spending bill, push forward, and then it would become law, providing a pathway to citizenship for essential workers. So just to give you an idea then, because again, this is just a letter penned to just demand that it be included, and goes through different facts of why it's important and the sacrifice that essential workers have made, especially these undocumented essential workers who, especially since they tend to be in more low-income situations, live in more crowded family environments or home environments, which then increases the risk of spreading the virus. And so they are really putting their lives at risk to keep our economy growing. And the main takeaway from this is that if they were important during the pandemic to keep the economy going, then they'll be even more important during the recovery phase, which is the whole point of this act, is to provide them the citizenship so we can reliably have them here during this time when it's really dependent on them working to recover the economy. Now, there's a couple of different facts and summaries about this, but I did want to mention this about who would count as an essential worker. And this fact sheet provides some idea. I'm going to expand it up again. And so here, when it says eligible essential workers, I'm going to share my screen a little bit more zoomed in. Perfect. And just to quickly read it down, because it includes quite a bit of people, right? Is that eligible essential workers, the bill would apply to all undocumented workers as well as H-2A and H-2B temporary foreign workers who have earned income in an essential occupation at any point from the start of the COVID-19 emergency until 90 days after it's ended. It still has not officially ended, so we don't know when this 90 days would end, but just as an idea and a heads up. Eligible essential workers do not have to meet a minimum hours worked or employment duration requirement. The bill lists several industries and occupations that qualify as essential, including agricultural work, both seasonal and year-round, and essential critical infrastructure labor and services, which, as defined by the Department of Homeland Security, covers a wide variety of occupations related to food and agriculture, in addition to various other occupations. So this is sort of covering what I mentioned, that it's very broad in who's covered and who would qualify for this. So I think it's a very generous approach to it. But again, this is very much work reliant. You had to be working in an essential job to be able to get this pathway to citizenship. Those who were not, who are studying, you would not be covered under this, and that's very unfortunate. But again, it is a way to quickly set up a pathway to citizenship for many people. And I want to share this fact sheet, which is from one of the House representatives who introduced it, Representative Castro. He put together a rather nice fact sheet, very straightforward, just 2 pages. I'll share that in the description so that you also have it in case you want to learn a little bit more of what's included in this bill, which would hopefully be included in the infrastructure bill. But the first page is really just a summary of key points in terms of a description of who are undocumented essential workers. And so it goes through that. More importantly is the second page, where you can see just how broad the scope of this would be in terms of who would qualify for it from the actual sponsor of the bill. So this is from the bill itself, from the person who wrote it. So you can essentially rely on this as being very accurate in terms of who is covered. So just to go through a few, right? We have healthcare, we have agriculture, construction, emergency response, food, restaurants, hotels, really the entire industry, really. Even childcare, domestic work, which is an amazing thing to include in there. Even laundry services, warehousing, manufacturing. So quite a bit. And also leaves it open, saying that any other work that's deemed essential by the Department of Homeland Security. So that can also help increase the scope later on. So let's see here. There's also some other caveats which tend to help, right? So it says it'll also include undocumented workers who worked in essential industries but lost employment due to COVID-19. So that means if you were working in one, but then you were laid off, you weren't able to stay in work because of the pandemic, reducing the capacity for some employment to keep people on the payroll, you can still qualify for this. So it's an amazing piece to make sure that people who for no fault of their own, lost their job, would still be able to go for this. And it also mentions here that this also would include undocumented relatives of an essential worker who died from the virus. So still very morbid that someone would have to die from the virus, especially because of our lacking of a healthcare system. But at least there is some, I guess, a silver lining when it comes to that at least their relatives would be able to have this pathway to citizenship coming from this rather unfortunate tragedy. So this, again, is just a fact sheet to understand what could potentially be in the next infrastructure bill. It's not guaranteed. It does seem that many congressional members are in support of including this, even the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. So that would be brilliant if they can include it. Again, it is although it is broad in the who would qualify as an essential worker, is again still limited to employment-based opportunity, yes? Where compare it to the U.S. Citizenship Act, which is very broad. It is a general pathway to citizenship as long as you were in the country for a certain time, then that is fine. This one, again, is more specified for employment purposes. So we're going to see what comes of this. If President Biden does agree to include it, of course, we'll let you know. But for now, we're not sure if it will be, and we're just going to have to keep an eye on it. Very straightforward. There's not much else to know about it. And that seems to be a general point of what's going on in immigration reform. And the reason why I wanted to start with this one first is that we've not really seen much work or progress when it comes to immigration reform in both the House and Senate. It does seem that until the border crisis itself is resolved, we're not going to see much movement. It's essentially very... You would need a representative to be very committed to wanting to push immigration reform for them to even take a stance right now. Republican representatives are just essentially trying to benefit from the crisis and the human suffering that's ensuing by really setting themselves up for the next election cycle to then take control of the House or Senate, depending on how poorly it goes for Democrats, especially because a lot of what is at risk right now is that the Democrats made a lot of promises going into this election, right? And we've seen kind of the results of it, is that in order to play the game of politics during the COVID pandemic, they would at times kill or hold up bills that would have benefited the American worker just to weaken former President Trump's standing. Whether that's good or bad, that's up to you to decide. But for me, I don't believe in prolonging people's suffering just for a game of politics. Nevertheless, the result of that was, yes, the President Biden won the election, but we saw that the House is very tight in its margin of the Democratic majority, and in the Senate, even worse. It is very, very narrow in terms of all Democrats, all Democratic senators need to be on the same page and agree to support immigration reform in order for anything to happen. And as we've been covering week after week, that seems unlikely. But again, it's old news now, but Senator Manchin being open to the idea of a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants is great. Again, the caveat is that he believes in increased enforcement and that we need to up the security at the border. That's sort of like what we were expecting from moderate Democrats who are essentially Republicans, really. So, again, just to keep this all in mind, no guarantee that this might happen, right, in terms of the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act, but it is something to look forward to, possibly. And I'm just going to quickly run through the ones we've been watching, just so they're on your radar. No progress on the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. No progress on the DREAM Act. No progress here. No progress there. And, of course, nothing in terms of the Republican side of them trying to propose their pathway to citizenship or comprehensive immigration reform. So, again, it really seems to be hinging on getting the border under control, trying to see what's the best way to do that. And hopefully that doesn't mean upping more security or putting in more restrictive policies. It does seem that the public has been doing a good job of pressuring the Biden administration from not going down that route, which is great. I think that's the best thing that we can do, is just keep pushing him and holding him accountable to what he promised and what he's doing. So I think that that's great. And not to forget, obviously, that he is a political person. He's a politician. And so to not always take his words at face value and instead be very critical, be very understanding that we need to keep an eye on him and his administration and even the Democratic Party in both the House and Senate to make sure that we're able to push them to get comprehensive immigration reform going forward. And as usual, the information I love to share with you guys, right, is just on how you can take some action. Please, less than 5 minutes, call this general number if you already know your representative's name. That's all they're going to ask you for. There's no requirement that you need to be a U.S. citizen, that you need a legal status. It's as simple as, do you know your representative's name, right? Representative someone. My go-to is always Senator Menendez, right? If you know his name, call the general number, say, I want to speak to the office of Senator Menendez. They'll connect you right away, and you leave your message in support of any of the variety of immigration reform bills that we have as an option, right? So please make sure to do that. Less than 5 minutes. You can do it as many times as you want to. You can feel free to spam call them every single day if you can. If you don't know your representative's name, visit the website scrolling down the bottom. It'll walk you through how to find their name, how to even find their direct number if you want to do it that way. But again, as long as you have their name, call this general number, which is the Congressional switchboard, and they'll connect you right away. So there's your options. I hope you can continue to support immigration reform as we go forward. And yeah, let's just keep on doing this, keep on pushing. There's no guarantee. There's never really any guarantee, but we need to know that there's people in need of reform. There's lives at stake, millions and millions of lives that would benefit from a comprehensive immigration reform, both for undocumented immigrants in this country, but also for those who are coming down a more legal route. They also deserve some kind of comprehensive reform to improve the system and make sure that they're not waiting years and decades just to be processed. And that's part of the reason why people feel obligated or forced to come through an illegal, unauthorized route. As usual, thank you so much for joining us this week. Again, I'm sorry that there's not much to cover in terms of reform. As we get anything else that comes up, obviously I'll do another more detailed segments as we usually cover here on this show. I like to go step by step with you. If you have any questions about a certain bill or you want me to cover one in more detail, now that we are kind of in a void of having any updates on reforms, feel free to do so. Just leave it in the comments. If you're on Facebook, feel free to do that or message me directly on the Facebook page. Or if you're watching on YouTube, leave it in the comments and I'll make sure to pick it up there and give you a more detailed review on any of the bills that you want. But for now, that's all. Thank you, as always, for being here. And as usual, we're back each week on the weekend, Saturday in English, Sunday in Spanish, 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is Washington and California, or 4:30 p.m. if you're in New York, New Jersey side of the country. But as always, thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.